First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kodesh. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Acts, the 18th chapter. And pretty much where we're at with it, you have Paul, which is still on his second missionary journey. If we take a look here at this nice map, following the Troy, if we look more to the west, right, in the area of Greece, Paul is now in Acts 18 making his way to Corinth, right, as we're about to read. So from Athens over there to Corinth. So it says here, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. Now Pontus, when you go back here, if you look all the way to the east, or the right side of this picture, or the top right corner, that's that region there of Pontus. Okay, so that was a long way to end up over there in Corinth. But anyway, it says here, he meets this Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came on to them. So Paul ends up, running into these Jews that were expelled, or part of the Jews that were expelled from Rome during the time of Claudius. And he comes on to them. And if you look this up here, right, Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome, they tell you that there's a lot of different authors that wrote about this as well. And they say that this wasn't the first time that Jews were expelled or kicked out of Rome. But reading an account here, I'm just going to read this short part of by Suetonius. It says here, a brief statement in Divis Claudius 25 mentions agitations by the Jews, which led Claudius, the Roman emperor, which from about 41 to 54 AD, to expel them from Rome. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, the Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome. And Chrestus here was the way they referred to Yahweh Shai. So you can read more about it if you're interested, but the account is there. It's recorded in secular history as well. So that's how Aquila and his wife Priscilla end up over there in Achaia, which is the region where you had Athens and Corinth and so on. That's this chunk down here, right? You have Macedonia up here, and then you have the region of Achaia down there. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought. For by their occupation they were tent makers. So Paul was also a tent maker. He had that in common with them. So he ended up staying with them, and they worked. Keep in mind, right? The Apostle Paul, in a lot of these areas that he went to, he traveled to, he would find work to do, right? As he even mentions in his epistle to the Thessalonians, right? Rather than to burden them, they would work to provide for themselves as they were dwelling there, because it wasn't like he was there for a day or two. Most of the time, it'd be at the least, some weeks, depending on how urgent his job was in that area, or sometimes even years. Verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. All right, the Jews being the Israelites that were in that region that knew they were Israelites, right? They would go to the synagogue, they would follow the laws, they knew the customs and so on. And would go to Jerusalem as well to keep the holy days. And then the Greeks were Israelites, which weren't raised in the customs of Israel, right? And were thought of by themselves and also by the Jews as being of another nation, right? Being practicing the Greek customs, but through the preaching of Yahweh Shai, they were brought back to the fold. having now being taught the realization of who they actually were, but more importantly, above that, salvation through the faith in Yahushua. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the spirit and testified to the Jews that Yahushua was the anointed. So when we go back and look here, so far what has happened is we know when Paul and company made it to Philippi. This is Paul, Silas, Timothy. When they made it to Philippi, he rebukes that demon off of the maiden, the demon that she was using to divine and bring her masters a lot of riches. The masters get upset. They send Paul to the magistrates. Paul and Silas are beat and thrown in prison. Right at that point, they convert one of the guard of the prison. Eventually, they're released. They go from there. They travel all the way. Eventually, they make it to Thessalonica. They stay there for about 3 weeks. Right? They teach. You have a lot of Israelites there that believe. So the community forms. The church is growing, but they have to leave prematurely because the Jews that were there, the unbelieving ones, stirred up the city against them, right? So they had to basically leave from there. So while in Berea, they're teaching over there, those wicked Jews from Thessalonica follow them to Berea, come and stir them up over there. And then Paul is escorted out of there all the way to Athens. Silas and Timothy stay behind. And during that time, while Paul is at Athens and makes his way to Corinth, before Silas and Timothy come back to him, Timothy is sent back to Thessalonica to go there, to check up on them, to confirm their faith, right, and to build them up some more. And afterwards, he brings the good report of them and how they're doing to Paul, right? So when we're reading here in Acts 18, and it says here that when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, right, that's what they were doing there. And Timothy brought word again to Paul about how those that were in Thessalonica were doing, in the faith and their good works and so on. And so it is during Paul's time here, while he is on his second missionary journey, he's at Corinth, that he writes those letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to the brethren and the believers in Thessalonica. So back in Acts 18:5, right, when they were come to him, his spirit was pressed. He was pressed in the spirit. So having gone back and forth with those that were there, his spirit eventually got to the point where he couldn't just stay there without preaching and testifying the truth of Yahushua. So he ends up doing that. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, so they rejected it, they insulted him, they blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be upon your own heads. What that means is you will be guilty for your own deaths or your own destruction due to your unbelief. I am clean. From henceforth, I will go on to the Gentiles. So he's saying here, I'm not responsible for whatever happens to you because I've done my job. If you didn't know and I didn't do my job in teaching it to you, then I would incur guilt. But now you know, and you have consciously rejected it. So that's on you. From henceforth, I'm going to go on to the Gentiles. These are Israelites that didn't know they were Israelites, but a lot of them believed. So Paul said, I'm going to focus on them because a lot of you are caught up in the ways of, the you could say the Pharisaic doctrine, and you're stuck in that. And a lot of them didn't want to, a lot of them of the circumcision, their eyes were not open to believe. But that was also to fulfill prophecy. The Lord said he would provoke them, just as Israel, back in the Old Testament, just as Israel provoked the Lord to wrath by those that are no gods, he said he would provoke them by those that are not a nation or that are not a people. That was referring to these Israelites that would lose knowledge of their heritage and would, over different generations, practice the customs of the heathen nations they were around. So they would be considered like a no people, but they're the ones who the Lord would provoke the circumcision to jealousy with. And that's why the Lord had it to where a good amount of Israelites that were of the circumcision did not believe. And instead, a lot more that were not of the circumcision believed. And a lot of these evil works that the Jews that didn't believe did against Paul and the rest of the believers was out of envy because of those that were, quote, Gentiles, right? Israelites in a Gentile state of mind, newly coming in, because of a lot of them believing. These Jews here, out of envy, did these things onto the preachers. They persecuted the preachers of Yahushua. Verse 8, and he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house was joined hard to the synagogue, meaning he was right like next door to the synagogue. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, or his house. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. And these that believed and were baptized were Israelites, a lot of them not knowing they were Israelites, but they had that faith in them because they were preordained from the foundation of the world to believe anyway. See, a lot of these Israelites that were being called Gentiles, had they not suffered the Hellenization, were they not forced out of their land and whatever situations befell them, they would have been, in this time, Israelites that knew they were Israelites. Okay? But it says here, a lot of them believed, they were baptized. Then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision. Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace. For I am with thee. Holding your peace means to be silent. So the Lord was encouraging Paul, continue speaking, continue teaching, and don't be afraid. For I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee. For I have much people in the city. See, so I got your back. Nobody's going to be able to harm you. But there are a lot of my sheep that are in the city that need to hear this word. So continue to preach. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. And I believe at this point, this is somewhere around 50, around 50 to 52 or so AD, within that time period. So he's amongst them. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, once again, Achaia being this bottom region right here, and the deputy meaning he was, it's one of the offices of the Romans. I believe here he was either a consul or a proconsul. But let's look it up here. So let's look up first, who is Gallio? Historically, I believe he is known as the brother of Seneca, the philosopher. Yep, tells us right here. So Junius Annaeus Gallio, or Gallio, the Roman proconsul of Achaia. Now, a proconsul is one in the high office. A proconsul is a governor of a province in ancient Rome, having as much authority as a consul. So now, what is a consul, you might ask? A consul is, in ancient Rome, one of 2 annually elected chief magistrates who jointly ruled the republic. Kind of like a president in a way. An official appointed by a government to live. Okay, no, we're dealing with the ancient Roman version of this. So he was like the equivalent of a consul, but over one of the provinces of Rome, being here Achaia. It says here, when Paul was in Corinth around 53 AD, so they place him, and these dates are really all approximations, circa. Under the Emperor Claudius, in Acts 18 and 12, he was brother, this is Gallio, of Jusius Annaeus Seneca, the philosopher. Jerome, in the Chronicle of Eusebius, says that he committed suicide in 65 AD. Weiner thinks he was put to death by Nero. This is Gallio. So you know a little bit about who he is. Let's take a look here about, well, we already know what the deputy is here, right? It'd be like a governor, or in his case, a proconsul. We sort of just read about that now. So during his term as proconsul in Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul. So they joined and they all basically started to speak against Paul and caused this not a riot per se, but like disruption in the city concerning Paul, and brought him to the judgment seat. And the judgment seat would be in their area, the kind of like their equivalent of Mars Hill or Marshall Peak that the Athenians had. So they brought him there. There you would have the seat. The magistrate would sit there. He would hear the cause. If there was an announcement made, it would be made there. And if there was a judgment sentence to be passed, it would be given there. So they bring Paul there, saying, "This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law." And they were basically saying that in him preaching Yahushua and the resurrection of Yahushua and these things, they were trying to push the case that Paul was trying to influence people to worship God other than how their laws required them to, right? Like that salvation is not going to be through circumcision. And meanwhile, like if you go into the law, right, it's in there. So these are things that they were angry about. And at this time, Judaism was technically considered like a protected religion as well. So the Jews in these different provinces of Rome were actually allowed to practice, Judaism and not be forced to worship the other gods of the city and be exempted in certain cases as well. The book of Josephus goes into that as well. How I think it was Agrippa, I forget if it was Agrippa II or which Agrippa it was that spoke to one of the Caesars because he was close to him, and had it to where he said basically you want to avoid these Jews rioting and all throughout your provinces, so don't try to push certain things on them, and rather allow them to observe their Sabbath and those kinds of things. So on the Sabbath they wouldn't be required to say do certain things that maybe might be required of other citizens. So certain privileges like that. So they come and they're trying to bring charges up on Paul. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth to make his defense, Gallio said unto the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you." So if this was a case of, he had broken the law, he had done some real wicked act, then I would have a reason to listen to you or to give you a hearing. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye into it, for I will be no judge of such matters. I'm not going to judge between back and forth disagreements of your law. That's up to you. I'm not a Jew, as he's basically that's his perspective on it. And I guess it would be the equivalent of like if let's say in Israel today in the ministry you have different groups that teach different things, and some teach the mark of the beast as something, many different things, right? Sin in all its various ways. Some teach that Yahushua is not to be worshipped, right? Some teach these different things. So imagine trying to bring that up to a court, right, in New York, or a court, a Supreme Court, to hear that, or even to the police station to say, look, hey, can you, handle this guy because he's going around teaching that the mark, the MOTB is not the CHIP. They're not going to do anything about that because that to them it's like, bro, that's a matter of your concern, right? You deal with that. If you were saying this person has committed murder, this person is done, I don't know, aggravated assault, battery, something like that, that's different. So to put it in perspective there, verse 15, but if, Slakia, verse 16, and he drave them from the judgment seat, so he dismissed them. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue. Now this is a different synagogue because you had one which was what's his name? Crispus, right? But then you had a different one, and Sosthenes was one who actually believed. Paul even mentions him. I forget in which letter it was. First Corinthians. Yep. Because I mean, they are in Corinth. So Paul called to be an apostle of Yahushua HaMashiach through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. So they took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue. Now, the chief ruler of the synagogue, their role would be to, one, like maintain everything, to oversee the things that would happen, right? They maintained the building, they ran the services, if there were guests or speakers, they would moderate and have speakers come and speak, and they sort of oversaw a lot of those things. But here, him being a believer, it says here that the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of those things. Because once again, keep in mind that you had Israelites that were also raised in the Greek customs, in the sense that, or let me say it this way, you had Israelites that spoke Greek, right? And they were living in these different areas, but some of them already knew they were Israelites, even though they couldn't speak Hebrew. It's like somebody from some Eastern country that's born in America, and they know where they're from, and they know who they are, but they don't speak their native language, right? They're like Americanized, but they still know who they are. So you had some, because it wasn't just just the Jews that were like fully aware that they were Israelites. So they took him because they were in disagreement with what he believed in, and they beat him before the judgment seat. And as it says, Gallio cared for none of those things. He just didn't even look that way. And Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren. So he stayed there for a good amount of time, and then eventually he was ready to depart, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head at Cenchrea. Shorn is to shave his head, for he had a vow. And when you go back to the law, if you were under a vow, you let, depending on the kind it was, you let your hair grow for that period of time till you fulfill the vow that it is, and then you would shave your hair, because that hair would be offered as like an offering to the Lord. So Paul's now left Corinth, but as it says here, he sailed into Syria. Now, if we look here at following the red from the west side from Corinth, when the author says, right, that he sailed into Syria, you can see Paul's next destination was actually Ephesus, right, in Asia Minor. What he means by he sailed into Syria, right, is, let's actually let's look up the word, let me see what it was. Was it into? So you see here it says into, onto, to, towards, because his destination, his ultimate destination, was going to be Syria. So he sailed toward Syria, but he was going to make some stops before there. All right, and that's why you see the next stop he made, as we go into verse 19, was Ephesus. And he came to Ephesus and left them there, that is Priscilla and Aquila. But he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when it says reasoned there, he was basically like blanking on a word to use here, but to go in and talk with them, right, concerning the scriptures. So let's go into that word there. To think different things with one's mind, to mingle thought with thought, right? That's having your discussions, conversing, discourse, sometimes arguments, disputes. It's like when an Israelite, a modern day Israelite, who knows the scriptures, meets a Christian, and you start talking about the Bible. That's an example of it, right? They're going to say something and say, well, actually, this is what it says, and you're going to go to this precept, then they're going to say, well, but what about this verse? And then you're going to go, that kind of thing. It says here, when they desired him to tarry longer with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem. But I will return again unto you, if God will, and he sailed from Ephesus. So at this time, he was likely going to keep one of the holy days that required him to be at Jerusalem. And so he stayed at Ephesus for a short period of time. He left Priscilla and Aquila over there. He taught some of them over there. And so you would know that eventually you would have a church of Ephesus, right? And you would have brethren or believers over there that would believe or had believed based on Paul's teachings. So he sails from there all the way, boom, to Caesarea, which is like a port or a port city over there. And then from there makes his way to Antioch. So where are we at? But if you look at the trail here, it shows he first goes to Jerusalem because that's where he went to keep that feast, and then he made his way to Antioch. So where are we here? We are verse 22. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. And so we went to Antioch. That concluded his second missionary journey, right? He stayed there for some time, and then in verse 23, it begins his third missionary journey. So I have a map here. There we go. This one is not as clear as the first one, but if you look at it, it's really following kind of the same, it's like an identical trail to where he had already gone, because he was going to the same places that he had already, the same churches he had already visited and taught. So verse 23, and after he had spent some time there in Antioch, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples, right? So once again, and I mean, I can even pull it up here, right? Galatia, Phrygia, you can see these different areas, the churches in there, the brethren that were there. He went there, strengthening them, right? Seeing how they were doing, they were glad to see him, speaking with them, seeing how they've grown since the beginning, and any places of improvement, any exhortations he would give them. Verse 24, and a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man. So he was a good speaker. And Alexandria is in Egypt. And mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. So he knew, right? He knew the scriptures. He was a good speaker. So he makes his way to Ephesus. And remember that Paul had left Priscilla and Aquila at Ephesus. So it says, this man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. So he was preaching, all right, about the Lord, but only with a limited knowledge, because he only knew the as it says, the baptism of John, right? The things that John was teaching. And yet he was speaking, he was a very strong speaker. He could reason with you, really well, and so it says here, and he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom, when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. And let's actually go into that word perfectly. But what they did was they noticed his zeal and his ability and his speaking and the mind that he had. And so they brought him onto themselves, and the things that they were taught of Paul, which was the more perfect way. So going past the baptism of John, okay, who, as it says exactly and accurately, right? So John preached about this one that was to come. Well, guess what? That one has come. He is Yahushua. These are the scriptures that prove that, and so on. So they gave him the wholeness of the doctrine. So now he could teach the full truth. And when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, so the Spirit was on him to want to go through Achaia or go to Achaia, where you had the brethren at Athens, the believers that were there, and in Corinth, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, to welcome him, who, when he was come, helped them much, which had believed through grace, because he was a good speaker, he knew the scriptures, and now he had been taught the fullness of it, so he was able to build them up even more, to exhort them, to strengthen their faith, right, and to teach them, more things. For he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, shewing by the scriptures that Yahushua was the anointed. That was the more perfect way that he was taught of Priscilla and Aquila, or Aquila and Priscilla. So when he went with his already good ability to speak and his good knowledge of the scriptures, they weren't able to resist or gainsay the things that he was teaching. And that brings us to the end of the book of Acts, the 18th chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodash. Until next time, Shalom.